Darling, is the wind blowing today? I'd like to watch television, darling. Russia, please, if you can, get us Hillary Clinton's emails. Please, Russia, please. He asked Russia to go get the emails. We're going.
The United States, in its relatively short time as an independent nation, has seen many great leaders. However, it's also seen many leaders of more questionable competency. For this video, we analyzed the opinion of historical scholars to come up with 5 of the worst presidents of all time. Some of their mistakes helped incite the Civil War. Some defended slavery and other immoral practices, while others contributed to the biggest economic meltdowns America has ever seen. This list is proof that winning an election doesn't mean you're a good leader. Franklin Pierce. Despite being a Northerner, Franklin Pierce was against abolition, believing it to be a threat to the American Union. Pierce's most notorious act was signing into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This bill overrode the Missouri Compromise, which had temporarily balanced the scales between slave-supporting South and anti-slave North. In its place, the Kansas-Nebraska Act put the issue of slavery within these states to vote. This was a bad move, considering that the only people allowed to vote at this point in American history were white male landowners. The end result would be the admittance of Kansas as a slave-holding state in defiance of the aforementioned Missouri Compromise, which had previously outlawed slavery in these territories. He also enforced the Fugitive Slave Act, a law that persecuted men, women, and children fleeing southern slave plantations for the North. Under this act, escaped slaves that made it north were hunted down to be returned to their masters in the South. His general lack of confrontation on the issue of slavery was one of the contributing factors to the American Civil War. As a further embarrassment, he attempted to acquire Cuba from Spain but failed. He was likely an alcoholic and died at age 65 of liver failure, a suitably sad end for one of the most ineffective presidents ever. James Buchanan. Often cited as the worst president of all time, his greatest flaw was a severe mishandling of the issue of slavery. One of the most controversial issues in American history, this is an issue you really don't want to be on the wrong side of. At the time, slavery was already considered barbaric in the northern states, yet Buchanan, despite being a Northerner, held a sympathetic view towards this evil practice. He infamously presided over the Dred Scott ruling, which upheld Southern anti-slave laws even for those who had escaped into the North. Now, in fairness to him, this ruling came from the Supreme Court, not from the president. But he did nothing to help the case. In fact, he did the opposite. In private letters to Justice John Cantron, Buchanan not only approved the ruling but suggested it be applied as broadly as possible, holding it would settle the issue of slavery. Buchanan followed this up by allowing Kansas to join the U.S. as a slave state. Throughout his presidency, he continued a pattern of partial appeasement toward the South, giving in to enough of their demands to anger the North, but not enough to satisfy the South. His lack of action on the issue allowed the situation to gradually worsen, deepening the divide between the North and the South. This eventually led to the Civil War. Being the president who presided over the greatest schism in U.S. history and almost allowing the country to fall apart entirely makes him arguably the worst president ever. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was the first president to ever be impeached, and for good reason. He was not a very good president. Andrew Johnson came to power following Lincoln's assassination and was clearly not ready for the role. He first fell out of public favor due to his reintegration policy following the Civil War. Most notably, he opposed having any sort of protections for the former slaves. Leaving African Americans to fend for their own without any sort of support was not popular with Lincoln's party, who controlled Congress at the time. Such a policy would have essentially doomed the newly freed citizens who had no money, no property, no jobs, and little other means by which to make a new life for themselves. He just barely managed to avoid being removed from office, escaping by one vote during impeachment. But rather than use this as an opportunity to reflect and change his ways, Johnson committed to more of the same weak passivity. During the Reconstruction, a pivotal era of U.S. history when Southern states were rebuilding post-Civil War, Johnson's lack of action would have great repercussions. Johnson allowed Southern states to rebuild almost without any oversight. Naturally, most states chose to reinstate many of the same leaders and policies that led to the Civil War in the first place. While they couldn't openly reinstate slavery, Southern leaders were able to find loopholes that allowed them to preserve elements of the racial hierarchy. This would later come to be known as the Jim Crow era. Worst of all, he opposed the 14th Amendment. This is the amendment to the U.S. Constitution that granted rights to the freed slaves and outlawed slavery. In other words, he opposed the most essential piece of post-Civil War legislation ever. He opposed granting equal rights to people who had been so tremendously wronged by the very thing the Civil War was fought over. Needless to say, Andrew Johnson had a negative impact on U.S. history and helped fuel many of the problems that would plague the United States into the Civil Rights era. Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover had the misfortune of being president during the worst economic crisis in U.S. history. The Great Depression was a period of roughly 10 years during which the once prosperous United States of America fell into financial ruin. Unemployment is estimated to have reached as high as 25%, and the value of shares on the stock market fell by 90%. Many banks closed, and the impact was even felt in other countries. International trade dropped by over 50%, and the global economy fell as a whole. Of course, this is not entirely the fault of President Hoover, but many blamed him for his lack of action. The general belief among modern economists is that more aggressive government stimulus could have possibly prevented the Great Depression, or at least reduced its impact. Hoover initially made no such moves, despite warnings from experts of the time. His belief was that the economic downturn was simply the result of a lack of confidence in the American people and expected that it would only last a year or so. It would instead last over a decade. Even as the situation worsened, Hoover refused to give any relief to the American people, believing welfare to be solely the responsibility of local governments and private charities. Although he did eventually make some concessions, such as having the Federal Reserve cut interest rates, it was too little, too late. When homeless camps began springing up all across the United States, they came to be derisively called Hoovervilles, permanently associating his name with the Great Depression within the collective consciousness of all Americans. He eventually tried to blame Mexicans for the Depression, deporting as many as 1 million Mexicans, according to some estimates. It's estimated that between 40 and 60% of those deported were U.S. citizens by birthright, the vast majority of these being children. He also worked to remove as many African Americans as possible from his party, the Republicans. The move was intended to increase the party's favorability among whites, but would have negative consequences in the long term. His time as president came to an end in 1932 when he was crushed by Franklin Roosevelt in a landslide.
A word of appreciation for all of the splendid work that they have done, and I wish it were possible for me to extend this word of thanks to each one of them individually.
Richard Nixon. Compared to the others on the list, Nixon achieved much more success. He helped create the Environmental Protection Agency and established better relations with China and the Soviet Union. However, his presidency was also highly flawed. Despite initially promising to bring peace to Vietnam,
in view of these circumstances, there were some who urged that I end the war at once by ordering the immediate withdrawal of all American forces.
Nixon expanded bombing programs, sending a mixed message and prompting Americans to declare him a hypocrite on the issue. This was one of the contributing factors to the infamous Kent State incident, where policemen shot at anti-war protesters on the Kent State College campus, killing 4. He also tried to prevent the release of the Pentagon Papers, documents that exposed the lies and corrupt actions of various U.S. officials regarding the war. Nixon's withdrawal of troops from the war did not have the desired result. Nixon's aim was a long-term peace between North and South, but he failed to cultivate this peace, resulting in a North Vietnamese takeover in contrast to American interests. In other foreign policy blunders, Nixon continued covert operations against Fidel Castro, but they all failed completely. He increased U.S. arms sales to Iran and other Middle Eastern countries, which would later prove to be a bad move, and his overt support for Israel increased tensions in the region. The eventual result was the oil crisis of 1973, which would, unfortunately, set a trend for future issues involving the oil trade. Inflation was another major issue for his administration, one which Nixon seemingly had no answer for. Although he implemented price control legislation, the end result was food shortages and little effect on inflation itself.
Good evening. I want to talk to you tonight about some strong actions that I have ordered today with regard to the American economy. Actions which will be important to you in terms of the wages you earn and the prices you pay.
On a more positive note, Nixon was a supporter of civil rights and desegregation. He also pushed for the government to provide health care support, championing state-run HMOs and Medicaid programs.
The purpose of this program is simply this. I want America to have the finest health care in the world.
But he also supported the disastrous war on drugs, which saw the record-breaking prison populations without achieving any reduction in illegal drug use or sales.
America's public enemy number 1 in the United States is drug abuse.
Although Nixon was a popular president and had some successes, the end came for his presidency with the Watergate scandal. In June of 1972, several individuals were arrested for spying on major Democratic politicians, Nixon's rival party. The investigation revealed that these individuals had likely been funded by money originating in President Nixon's administration. Rather than owning up to it, Nixon did everything in his power to cover any involvement in the scandal, but was unable to outwit the investigators and eventually resigned as president.
There's the president waving goodbye, and you hear the applause.